Help! My husband's paternity test says our daughter isn't his, but I've never cheated. And now my marriage is falling apart. I'm 34, married, and I have a beautiful 5-year-old daughter named Lily. She's the light of my life, smart, funny, and she's got this adorable giggle that can brighten up even the worst days. My husband, Mark, and I have been together for almost a decade. We met in college, hit it off, and eventually tied the knot. Things haven't always been perfect, but up until recently, I thought we were solid. Anyway, about a month ago, something shifted. It started small, like Mark being quieter than usual or avoiding eye contact. I figured maybe work was stressing him out. He'd been pulling longer hours at the office, and I thought he just needed space. But then, one night, he came home late and barely said a word to me. Instead, he just sat on the couch, staring at Lily while she played with her Legos. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just shrugged it off. Fine, he said, but it didn't feel fine. I should have pushed harder, but I didn't want to nag him. I told myself he'd open up when he was ready. Then a week later, I found out what was really going on. Mark sat me down after Lily had gone to bed. He looked off, pale, tense, like he was bracing for impact. I need to talk to you about something, he said, his voice cold and distant. My stomach dropped. Okay, I replied, trying to keep my tone calm, even though my heart was racing. He pulled out an envelope from his pocket and slapped it on the table between us. I stared at it for a second, confused, before I picked it up and saw the heading, DNA Paternity Test. I froze. My hands started shaking. Mark, what is this? He didn't answer right away. He just leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said, It's proof. Proof that Lily isn't mine. I swear I felt the room spin. I opened the envelope, skimmed the results, and there it was in black and white. 0% probability of paternity. What? What are you saying? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. You know exactly what I'm saying, he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. I've been suspicious for a while now. You know why? Because Lily's got brown eyes, Claire. Brown. We both have blue. That's not possible, and you damn well know it. I was too stunned to speak. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mark, I finally managed to say, my voice breaking, I have never cheated on you. Never. I swear to God, I have no idea how this is possible. But he didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, the anger, the betrayal. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and left without another word. That night, I cried until my head hurt. This couldn't be happening. It just couldn't. The next few days were a nightmare. Mark barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was short and cold. He started sleeping in the guest room, well, more like locking himself in there. He even put a lock on the door. I didn't even know he had one lying around, but there it was. Lily, of course, noticed the tension. Kids are so much more perceptive than we give them credit for. Why isn't Daddy having breakfast with us? She asked one morning, her little forehead furrowed. I had to force a smile and say, Oh, sweetie, he's just busy. But inside, I was breaking. Mark started asking to see my phone, too. At first, I handed it over willingly because I had nothing to hide. But then I realized he wasn't just glancing at it. He was combing through it. Texts, emails, even my social media DMs. It didn't matter that he found nothing. He still looked at me like I was guilty. And the thing that hurt the most? He was pulling away from Lily. He stopped reading her bedtime stories, stopped asking about her day. It was like he'd convinced himself she wasn't his, so she didn't matter anymore. I tried to talk to him about it one night, desperate to break through the wall he'd put up. Mark, this isn't fair to Lily, I said, standing in the doorway of the guest room while he scrolled on his phone. She's 5 years old. She doesn't understand what's going on. He didn't even look up. She's not my daughter. Why should I pretend like nothing's wrong? I felt like I'd been slapped. She's still our daughter, Mark. Biology doesn't change that. You've been her dad since the day she was born. He finally looked at me, and his expression was ice cold. Maybe she's your daughter, Claire, but she's not mine. I walked away before I started crying again. At that point, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let this destroy my family. So I suggested we do another test, this time at a different lab. Maybe there was a mistake, I said, clinging to any shred of hope I could find. Let's test all of us, me, you, and Lily. Maybe we'll get some clarity. Mark agreed, but only after I practically begged him. Fine, he said, his tone flat. But if it comes back the same, I'm filing for divorce. I didn't even argue. I just nodded, even though his words felt like a knife to my chest. While we waited for the results, I started digging through every piece of paperwork I could find from Lily's birth. Hospital records, discharge notes, anything. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but I needed to prove, to Mark, to myself, that I wasn't lying. The days dragged. Mark was still distant, but at least he wasn't outright hostile anymore. I think he was waiting for the test results before deciding how he really felt. And then, a week later, the results came in. I opened the email first because Mark was at work. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely type in the login information. When I finally saw the report, my stomach dropped. Lily wasn't Mark's biological daughter, but she wasn't mine either. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. This had to be a mistake, right? I refreshed the page, read the report again, and it still said the same thing. No biological relationship detected. I think I sat there for a solid 10 minutes, just trying to process what I was seeing. How could this be possible? I gave birth to Lily. I held her in my arms in that hospital room. I remembered every moment of that day. The pain, the joy, the overwhelming love when I saw her tiny face for the first time. I called Mark immediately. "You need to come home," I said, my voice shaking. "What is it?" he asked, sounding wary. "Just please. I can't do this over the phone." When he got home, I handed him my laptop with the results pulled up. He read them silently, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something I couldn't quite read. "What the hell does this mean?" he finally said, his voice low. "It means—" I started, but my throat tightened, and I couldn't get the words out. "It means Lily isn't ours. Either of ours. Mark and I knew right away that this was bigger than just a phone call. We needed legal help. The day after we got the initial confirmation from the hospital about a possible mix-up, we contacted a lawyer. I don't even know how we found the energy to sit in that office together, but we did. The lawyer, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Julia, listened carefully as we explained what had happened. She didn't seem shocked. Apparently, cases like this, while rare, do happen. But she emphasized that it was going to be a long, messy process to get to the truth. "First," she said, adjusting her glasses as she flipped through her notes, "we'll need to subpoena the hospital for all relevant records, delivery logs, staff assignments, anything that might help us piece together what went wrong. And then there's the matter of contacting the other family." Hearing her say that out loud, the other family, made my stomach churn. Somewhere out there, another couple was about to have their world turned upside down just like ours had been. Julia warned us that the hospital would likely be defensive. "They're not going to admit to any wrongdoing until they're absolutely cornered," she said. "And even then, they'll try to minimize liability. This could take months, even years." Mark finally spoke up, his voice tight. "And what about the girls? Our real daughter, wherever she is, and Lily? What happens to them?" Julia hesitated, then said carefully, "That's going to depend on you and the other family. There's no legal precedent that forces a switch, at least not in cases like this. But there will be a lot of emotions involved. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's going to be complicated." Complicated didn't even begin to cover it. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. The hospital, as Julia predicted, dragged their feet when it came to handing over records. But eventually, we got the documents we needed, and they confirmed what we'd feared. There had been a mix-up in the maternity ward. 2 baby girls had been born within hours of each other, and somehow they'd been swapped. The hospital's legal team reached out to Julia with an offer to settle. Money, of course, but no real admission of guilt. Julia advised us to hold off. "We're not just talking about financial compensation here," she said. "This is about accountability, and more importantly, about finding the truth." Meanwhile, the hospital also began the process of contacting the other family. That part made me so anxious I could barely function. What would they be like? Would they even want to meet us? And what if they did? Mark and I tried to keep things as normal as possible for Lily during all of this, but it wasn't easy. She could tell something was wrong, even though we hadn't told her anything yet. "Mommy, why are you and Daddy always talking in whispers?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. I just kissed her forehead and said, "Don't worry, baby. Everything's okay." But it wasn't okay. And I didn't know if it ever would be. It wasn't long after the hospital started contacting the other family that we got the call we'd been dreading and anticipating all at once. Julia rang me first, her calm voice steady as ever. The other family has been informed, and they've agreed to meet. The hospital will mediate the meeting, but I'll be there as well to represent you. I sat there, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Do they know everything? About the mix-up, about Lily? Yes, Julia said. They're understandably shaken, but they seem open to talking. Shaken. That word didn't even come close to describing how I felt. I thanked Julia and hung up, then immediately called Mark. For the first time in weeks, he didn't sound distant. He just sounded scared the same way I felt. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a neutral location, a conference room at the hospital. I barely slept the night before. My mind kept racing with questions. What would they be like? Were they kind? Were they angry? Were they going to demand we switch the girls back? And what would we even do if they did? The morning of the meeting, I felt like I was going to throw up the entire drive there. Mark was quiet beside me, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were pale. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. The tension in the car was enough to fill the silence. When we arrived, Julia met us in the hospital lobby and walked us to the conference room. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. And then the door opened, and there they were, the other family. The parents looked about our age, maybe a little younger. The mom had dark hair pulled into a ponytail, and the dad had a nervous, awkward smile. But what caught my attention immediately was the little girl sitting between them. She had blue eyes. I don't know why that hit me so hard. I mean, I knew logically that she'd look more like us than Lily does, but seeing it in person made my breath catch. She looked so much like Mark it was uncanny. The mom, her name was Rachel, was the first to speak. "Hi," she said, her voice trembling. I don't even know what to say. "Neither do we," I admitted, my own voice just as shaky. The dad, Tom, chimed in next. It's just so surreal. We've been trying to wrap our heads around it ever since the hospital called." He glanced down at the little girl beside him, who was busy coloring in a notebook and seemed blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. "This is Emily," he added. I smiled weakly. "She's beautiful." For a moment, we just sat there, looking at each other, none of us knowing how to bridge the impossible gap between us. Then Rachel asked the question I'd been dreading. "What do we do now?" I glanced at Mark, hoping he'd have an answer, but he just looked down at his hands. So I took a deep breath and said the only thing I could think of. "I don't know, but I think we need to take things one step at a time. Maybe we can start by getting to know each other." Rachel nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "Yeah, I think that would be good." We spent the rest of the meeting talking about the girls, about our lives, about how we wanted to move forward. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the emotions threatened to overwhelm all of us. But by the end of it, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't going to be simple or quick, but maybe, just maybe, we could figure it out together. That meeting was just the beginning. Nothing was resolved that day, but it was a start. Over the next few months, we took things slowly. Rachel and Tom were just as overwhelmed as we were, but they were good people, kind and thoughtful. It was clear they loved Emily as much as we loved Lily, and honestly, that was the only thing that kept me sane. We started by meeting up occasionally in neutral spaces, parks, coffee shops, places where the girls could play together without really understanding the weight of what was happening. I'm not sure how much Lily or Emily picked up on at first, but kids are intuitive. Lily eventually asked me, "Why do we keep meeting with that family?" I froze when she asked, and I could tell Mark was struggling too. We'd spent so much time trying to figure out what to say, but when the moment came, all the rehearsed lines vanished. Finally, I knelt down at her level and said, "Sweetheart, this is a really big, complicated story, but the short version is that we found out there was a mix-up at the hospital when you were born. That little girl, Emily, was supposed to come home with us, and you were supposed to go home with her mommy and daddy." Lily's eyes went wide. "So, I'm not yours." "No," I said quickly, gripping her little hands in mine. "You are ours. You've always been ours, and you always will be. Nothing changes that." My voice cracked, but I pushed through. "But Emily is connected to us in a special way too, and you're connected to Rachel and Tom." We're just trying to figure out how to make it all work." She thought about that for a long moment, then asked, "Does this mean I have two families now?" I glanced at Mark, who nodded slowly, and then I smiled at her. "Yeah, I guess it does." Lily seemed to accept that easily enough, but for Mark and me, it was much harder. We had to deal with the legal mess, the hospital's attempts at damage control, and most importantly, our own emotions. Mark struggled the most, I think. For weeks after that first meeting, he barely spoke. I could tell he was grappling with what it meant to be Lily's father when biology wasn't on his side. One night, I found him sitting on the edge of Lily's bed, watching her sleep. His face was a mix of love and heartbreak, and it broke something in me. "She's still my daughter," he said quietly, almost like he was trying to convince himself. "She always will be," I replied, sitting down beside him. "No DNA test can change that." Over time, we built something resembling a blended family. Rachel and Tom became part of our lives in a way I never could have imagined, and Emily and Lily became inseparable. Watching them together was bittersweet. They were like sisters, but there was always that underlying knowledge of how things could have been different. We never switched the girls. It was never even a question, really. They had grown up with the parents who had raised them, and no one wanted to uproot their entire lives. Instead, we all agreed to share this strange, messy, beautiful connection. The hospital settled eventually, of course. They paid out a hefty sum, but honestly, no amount of money could fix what had happened. What mattered most was that they put new policies in place to make sure this kind of mistake never happened again. As for us, life moved forward, slowly and not always smoothly, but it did. Mark and I worked through our issues, and I think in a way this whole ordeal brought us closer. It forced us to reevaluate what family really means. Now, 2 years later, things feel okay. Better than okay. Actually, Lily knows the full story now, and so does Emily. They're both handling it better than I ever could have hoped. Kids are resilient like that. And Mark? He's back to being the dad Lily adores. I still catch him watching her sometimes with that same mix of love and wonder. But now there's no heartbreak in his eyes, just pride.